They say you can still hear the scratching beneath the magnolia roots when the wind passes through St. Michael's Cemetery. 9 graves, 9 men buried alive, and one name whispered only in nightmares: Solomon Fairfax. This isn't the story the city of Charleston wants you to hear. It's the one that was sealed away, the one buried under false sermons and Southern pride. Because what happened between 1851 and 1855 wasn't an act of madness. It was a ritual of revenge, precise, deliberate, divine in its cruelty. When the renovation crews unearthed those coffins in 1923, they weren't supposed to open them. But curiosity always tempts men to lift the veil that protects them. The bodies inside weren't peaceful. Their fingernails were broken, their faces frozen in screams, and the air inside still faintly sweet reeked of the compound that had once paralyzed them from the neck down before they were buried breathing. Hidden beneath the magnolia tree was a leather journal. Cracked, waterlogged, written in a steady, intelligent hand, not the handwriting of a monster. It began with one sentence that explained everything. Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. That line ignited a chain of events that would turn Charleston's most trusted healer into its quietest executioner. A man who learned the language of death in the same rooms where white doctors taught him to save life. A man who realized too late that medicine and poison share the same alphabet, only the dosage changes the meaning. You see, Solomon Fairfax was never a brute. He was a scholar of herbs, a healer of body and spirit. But the society that enslaved him mistook gentleness for submission. And when you break a man who understands nature, you invite nature to remember you. Charleston in the 1850s was a cathedral of hypocrisy, marble pillars built over graves, sermons spoken over screams. The elite dined in candlelight while their shadows writhed in chains below. And in the shadow of that empire, a seed of vengeance took root, silent, patient, venomous. It would take 4 years to bloom, and when it did, every family that mocked mercy would be buried by the man they once called servant. This is not folklore. This is what happens when knowledge, forbidden, ancient, African, and alchemical, turns its gaze on the men who believed they owned the world. Solomon didn't just kill them. He taught them something, that the body dies slowly when truth awakens inside a lie. Now lean in, because from this point forward, you're not watching history. You're being initiated into it. They say madness begins in a single moment, a crack in the mind that lets the dark in. But Solomon Fairfax didn't break. He transformed. After the sale that shattered his family, he walked through Charleston streets like a ghost in daylight, unseen, but watching. Every cobblestone, every whisper of laughter from the houses along Meeting Street burned into him. He carried the sound of his children's cries like a pulse behind his eyes, and every heartbeat whispered one word: remember. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway took him in soon after, a man of science, reputation, and quiet arrogance. He saw Solomon not as a man, but as an instrument, a steady pair of hands that mixed tinctures, labeled jars, and fetched herbs from the marshes. But beneath that calm obedience, something had changed. Solomon had begun to read differently. Every Latin term became a weapon, every plant a possibility. He learned that the same roots used to calm a fever could, in the right concentration, freeze the breath. That the powder prescribed for pain could stop the heart if given at night. He cataloged everything silently, flawlessly. And when Hathaway praised his natural gift, Solomon smiled the way a storm smiles before it breaks. In the evenings, he would slip into the old gardens behind the practice. There, under the veil of moss and moonlight, he grew what no white doctor in Charleston would dare touch: African herbs his grandmother once called the sleep flowers. They whispered in languages older than English, older than mercy. And to each one he spoke a single vow: you will remember them for me. By 1852, Charleston's wealthiest men began to fall ill. The same men who had bid on his children. The same men who toasted over his wife's ashes. Their hands trembled. Their eyes grew dull. Physicians called it a fever of unknown origin. But Solomon knew the rhythm of their decline. He had crafted it, drop by drop, beneath their silver spoons and perfumed wives. He rewrote the order of power invisibly, beautifully. And yet he felt no joy. Revenge, he learned, is not the mirror of justice. It is the continuation of suffering but with purpose. Each man who began to choke, each pulse that slowed, was another letter carved into the scripture of his wrath. He wasn't killing them for satisfaction. He was curing Charleston of its diseased hypocrisy disguised as civilization. One night, as the first of the 9 began to convulse in his bed, Solomon stood in the doorway, calm, composed, watching the man's limbs stiffen. The wife screamed for help. Dr. Hathaway rushed in. Solomon handed him the wrong vial knowingly, the cure that killed. And as the last breath left that man's body, Solomon whispered under his breath, "Now you understand." He went home that night and wrote his first true entry in the leather journal. Vengeance is not the opposite of healing. It is the final stage. But something else began that night. A shadow that would not leave him, not fear, not guilt, something older. Something watching him back. Because once you speak to the forces beneath justice, they do not stay silent. They whisper in your dreams, and they begin to ask for more. By the spring of 1853, Charleston began to sweat fear. It started with whispers, the kind that travel faster than sound in a city that pretends not to hear them. A fever was sweeping through the upper class. But it wasn't the kind that made you shiver. It made you freeze. First came the numbness, then the tightening in the throat, and finally, the silence of paralysis that left its victims wide-eyed and awake as their lungs forgot how to breathe. Doctors called it the Charleston sleep, a condition so strange, so sudden, that even the most educated men could not name it. But Solomon could. He had designed it. He watched from the corner of Dr. Hathaway's office as the wives of Charleston's richest planters wept in silk, as the powerful men who once toasted to empire now convulsed like broken marionettes. And no one questioned the black assistant standing quietly in the shadows. No one suspected that the hand grinding their medicine was writing their epitaph. The bodies began to stack. 9 men of prominence, 9 pillars of Charleston's wealth, each claimed by the same invisible sickness. And though their deaths were recorded as complications of fever, their wives whispered a different word behind closed doors: curse. By now, Solomon's nightly rituals had changed. He no longer prayed for peace. He mixed his herbs like prayers, precise, ritualistic, reverent. Every dose measured against memory, every vial sealed with intent. He would sit under the magnolia tree after midnight, whispering names to the soil, returning the knowledge of pain to the earth that birthed it. But power, once tasted, begins to consume the hand that wields it. Solomon's dreams turned red. He saw his wife's body, burning but smiling. He saw his children, standing in the swamp, eyes black as night, whispering in unison, "Keep going, Father. They're not all gone yet." He awoke each dawn drenched in sweat, convinced that what he was doing wasn't murder, it was balance. That God, or something far older than God, had chosen him as the hand of correction. Charleston's churches held emergency sermons. The mayor ordered all public gatherings suspended. The city was dying, not from disease but from memory. Men feared to shake hands. Women feared to sleep beside their husbands. And somewhere beneath their panic, a quiet truth began to bloom. Maybe the sins of the city had learned to breathe. Through it all, Solomon moved like a shadow between rooms, silent, patient, collecting his poisons like a man building scripture. Each death he caused carved deeper into the mask of his humanity. He began to understand the one thing no doctor dared admit, that control was the truest currency of life. And as the 9th man was buried, he stood before the graves and whispered, "Your medicine has been administered. Your bodies will remember me." Now, brother, if you've followed this far, you've begun to understand the first law of hidden power. The system never fears violence. It fears knowledge. Because once you see how the poison is made, you can decide who drinks it. Comment below twice the phrase, "I see the pattern now." Write it twice so it locks in. Because after this point, you're not the same. You've stepped inside the circle. And what comes next is what the city of Charleston tried to erase forever. When the last of the 9 was lowered into the earth, Charleston tried to bury the story with them. But the ground does not forget what it swallows. And Solomon Fairfax had already begun to write. The journal was leather, cracked from salt air and candle smoke. Every page smelled of roots and iron blood mixed with ink. He didn't write like a man confessing sins. He wrote like a scientist documenting a cure. March 3, 1855. One entry began. They call it a curse. It is correction. The body of the city was diseased, so I became the surgeon. His words were steady, clinical. But between the lines, something pulsed a rhythm, an invocation. He wasn't just recording his actions. He was transmuting them, turning pain into power, loss into law. Each page began with a drawing. A plant, a skull, a sigil. Ancient symbols his grandmother once traced in ashes after funerals. Symbols that belonged to the world before slavery, before empire. Solomon had not simply avenged his family, he had resurrected a forgotten order. At night, beneath the magnolia tree that shaded the cemetery's oldest graves, he would read from his journal. Witnesses later claimed that his voice was calm, hypnotic, as if he wasn't praying to God, but negotiating with something else. Those who passed nearby spoke of a sound like breathing from the soil itself. And on still nights, the air trembled with a sweetness like crushed jasmine and decay. By 1855, Charleston's officials grew desperate. The deaths had stopped, but the fear hadn't. People whispered that the magnolia tree itself was cursed, that its roots drank guilt and bled sap that burned the tongue. A priest was sent to bless the cemetery. He left before dawn, pale and trembling, muttering that the air beneath that tree is awake. And it was, because Solomon's journal wasn't merely a record, it was a mirror. Every time he wrote a name, the ink darkened. Every time he described a symptom, it appeared again somewhere in the city, a faint echo of paralysis, a wave of nausea, a shared nightmare. The energy of vengeance was feeding on itself. Yet beneath his precision, a new voice had begun to speak from within the pages, not Solomon's. The words bled through old entries, written in a tone that mocked him. You thought you were the surgeon, but you were the patient. You thought you were cleansing the city, but it was cleansing you. He burned 3 pages that night. The smoke filled his lungs and left him dizzy. When he awoke, the ashes had formed symbols on the floor matching those carved into the coffins of the 9. Solomon understood then what most men never will. When you call upon justice without mercy, justice calls upon you. And as the city slept, he began his final entry. They will dig one day and find my truth, but they will not bury me again. The magnolia branches swayed though the wind was still, and somewhere beneath them the ground began to breathe. When Solomon Fairfax disappeared in the summer of 1855, Charleston exhaled not in relief, but in denial. The papers printed polite lies. Noted physician's assistant missing, presumed drowned. No one searched, no one dared, because every man of influence already suspected the truth and feared that saying his name aloud might make the paralysis return. Weeks later, a new headline surfaced. City to renovate old cemetery grounds. Behind that headline was the real operation, a cleansing. Officials ordered the exhumation of 9 coffins and the burning of a leather journal found beneath the magnolia tree. The public was told it contained medical notes of no importance, but the men in charge read every page first. Inside were recipes written in calm, technical script, compounds derived from native Carolina plants, mixed with imported tonics from Dr. Hathaway's stores. Nothing mystical, just chemistry, controlled, precise, unstoppable. The evidence was undeniable. Solomon had mastered the same science his captors claimed as proof of their superiority. And that was the real crime. The city council met behind locked doors that August. They agreed on 3 resolutions: erase the records, seal the graves, and remove every trace of Solomon Fairfax from Charleston's medical registry. Even the name was to vanish, a surgical extraction from history. But knowledge, once uncovered, never dies neatly. Young medical apprentices who handled the journal before it was destroyed copied fragments of the formulas. Those fragments circulated quietly through Charleston's underbelly among herbalists, former slaves, and even a few physicians who admired the brilliance of the work but not the man. They began calling the mixtures Fairfax powders. For years after, sudden deaths among the wealthy were quietly blamed on old air, bad water, or the lingering Charleston sleep. No one dared suggest that the mind of a slave had written the blueprint for their undoing. Decades later, after the Civil War, historians tried to piece together the missing chapter. They found court ledgers with entire pages torn out, letters between plantation families referencing the Fairfax incident as a cautionary tale not of murder, but of education. Because that was the true threat Solomon represented. A man who proved that knowledge was the great equalizer, that mastery of science and self could reverse the current of power. So the city rewrote him as a myth. They called him the shadow under the magnolia, and Charleston continued to polish its image of elegance, pretending the roots beneath its streets weren't fed by the fear of one man's intellect. Every empire hides its autopsy reports. Solomon Fairfax became Charleston's a dissection not of a body, but of conscience. The city learned that the easiest way to bury guilt is to rename it progress. And yet, every spring, when the magnolias bloom white over the graves, people say the scent carries something bitter, not supernatural, but historical, a reminder that truth, once learned, never sleeps again. When the cannons stopped and the Confederacy collapsed, Charleston should have been forced to face its reflection. Instead, the victors and the vanquished found common cause in forgetting. The city's marble facades still gleamed, though their foundations were ash. And the same families whose ancestors had once fallen to Solomon Fairfax's invisible hand were suddenly reborn as respectable businessmen, civic leaders, philanthropists. They called it Reconstruction, but it was really rebranding. In 1866, a council of former planters and newly arrived industrialists met in secret in a renovated church on Broad Street. Their purpose wasn't to rebuild homes, it was to rebuild hierarchy. The minutes of that meeting, preserved only in fragments, record one chilling line. Knowledge, not color, must be regulated if order is to return. They understood what Solomon's story had proved, that an educated mind could undo centuries of control. So they wrote new laws disguised as progress. Freedmen's schools were opened, but never funded. Medical apprenticeships for black students were quietly denied, for lack of moral suitability. A licensing board was created to standardize the practice of medicine. Its exams required Latin, and its fees equaled a year's wages. Every barrier was legal. Every barrier was permanent. Meanwhile, newspapers filled with ghost stories about the Fairfax plague, painting Solomon not as a scholar, but a warning. In public, Charleston praised redemption. In private, it rebuilt the same walls, this time with paperwork instead of whips. The poison had simply changed medium. By 1872, a new generation had grown up believing that the city's suffering came from war, not from the sickness that caused it. The archives show a phrase repeated again and again in speeches, sermons, even school primers. The past is best left to God. That sentence was Charleston's second burial of Solomon Fairfax. And for another century, it worked. But every time a black physician graduated from the new colleges in Philadelphia or Atlanta, every time a freed family bought land and planted crops of their own, a faint echo stirred beneath the magnolia tree. Not superstition, memory. Proof that knowledge, once seeded, cannot be legislated out of existence. The men who drafted Charleston's new constitution believed they had restored order. In truth, they had documented fear that intelligence, when awakened in the enslaved, would reveal how fragile power really is. They could silence his name, but they could not silence the idea that killed them. That mastery of the mind is freedom's first weapon. So the city moved on, clean on the surface, infected beneath. The Reconstruction years ended with monuments instead of apologies. And under each statue's bronze gaze lay the same secret, that Charleston's grandeur was rebuilt on amnesia, and that somewhere, between the lines of erased ledgers and sanitized textbooks, Solomon Fairfax was still writing. By the early 1900s, Charleston had learned to market its ghosts. Carriage tours replaced confession, tragedy became tourism. But history has a habit of digging itself up when the living grow too comfortable. In 1923, workers renovating St. Michael's Cemetery uncovered what official reports called a misalignment of graves. They expected water damage. They found 9 coffins, and inside each, the same thing. Splintered lids, curled fingers, faces turned toward the sky. The papers mention none of this. Instead, the Charleston Gazette printed a single sentence: old remains reinterred under supervision of city health authorities. Yet rumor spreads faster than silence. A night watchman spoke to a local historian, who recorded the story in her notes never published during her lifetime. Alongside her description of the coffins, she listed an object found a few feet deeper. A fragment of leather binding, faint traces of ink. 2 words still legible. Solomon Fairfax. That discovery set off a quiet academic war. For the first time, a few historians dared to cross-reference plantation ledgers, medical registries, and probate files. Patterns emerged. 9 wealthy deaths between 1851 and 1855, each recorded by Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, each attended by his enslaved assistant. The chemistry in the journal, What Little Could Be Reconstructed, wasn't sorcery. It was the science of toxicity, precise enough to pass for divine punishment in an age that feared its own ignorance. Universities refused to publish the findings. Funding disappeared. 2 researchers resigned after being accused of racial sensationalism. The city council sealed the archives again, citing respect for the dead. But by then, copies of the papers had already circulated among black scholars at Howard and Fisk. They recognized what Charleston could not admit: that Solomon's story was a chapter in the lineage of scientific resistance, the reclaiming of knowledge denied. Through the 1930s and 40s, his legend re-entered folklore as a parable whispered in low-country kitchens and prayer meetings. A tale not of vengeance, but of warning. Learn, and they will fear you again. Each retelling blurred the line between fact and myth, yet the evidence kept reappearing: handwriting comparisons, chemical analyses, eyewitness accounts from descendants who remembered the doctor's man, who vanished one humid night. By mid-century, archivists began to call the case Charleston's Forbidden File. And every decade since, a few more documents surface, pages the city swore never existed. Each page is a pulse. Each line, a breath rising from beneath the magnolia tree. Because history can be buried, but not erased. And the truth that once terrified Charleston's masters still whispers through its streets. That knowledge is not owned, it's inherited by anyone brave enough to claim it. Charleston today sells serenity. Pastel houses, slow tides, the sound of church bells dissolving in sea air. But look long enough and you'll see the design, the way beauty is arranged to distract you from its foundations. Every guided tour edits the city like a photograph, cropping out the laboratories that once hid behind kitchen walls, the bodies labeled property, the records signed in someone else's name. Yet beneath the cobblestones lies the same question Solomon Fairfax asked a century and a half ago. Who decides what knowledge is forbidden? His story isn't a ghost tale. It's a mirror. Each era rewrites its own version of the forbidden. In Solomon's time, education was contraband. Today, information itself is filtered by corporations, by algorithms, by the quiet arithmetic of profit and power. Every system that fears awareness behaves the same way Charleston once did. It buries its records, sanitizes its history, then teaches obedience as civility. Listen closely to modern language. Brand safety, data compliance, public confidence. Different words, same instinct to control what can be known. The plantation ledger became the corporate database. The licensing board became the algorithmic gatekeeper. And still, somewhere within the code, the idea of Solomon Fairfax breathes. That knowing how the system functions is the first step to unmaking it. Scholars tracing his legend now argue he never sought revenge. He sought equality through mastery. He believed comprehension itself was liberation, that if the mind could decipher the poison, the soul could refuse it. That belief terrified power then. It still does. Because knowledge does not stay loyal. Once learned, it travels. Once shared, it multiplies. And once multiplied, It cannot be contained by law, by myth, or by fear. Charleston will keep repainting its facades, just as every empire paints over its own cracks. But the line that began in a secret basement laboratory runs straight into our screens, our classrooms, our censored feeds. The same question pulses through it all. Will we be the next generation to forget, or the one that reads the buried notes and finally understands what they cost? Somewhere, a magnolia petal drifts onto a grave that no longer bears a name. And if you stand very still, you can almost hear the city breathe the truth it spent a century denying. That every civilization is only as honest as the history it refuses to bury. If history can be buried, it can be rewritten. Comment, I hear the magnolia whisper, if you made it to the end. It tells the algorithm and the archives that the silence didn't win. Subscribe for more forbidden history, mythic truth, and cinematic descent into the stories they swore you'd never know.